Hello, Carl. I hope you can hear and see me well. Very happy to have you on our stream today.
Vladimir, I can see you and I can hear you. And extremely happy to be with you, absolutely.
Thank you so much. Just a few short questions. What do you make of the current military situation in Ukraine? Clearly, Putin is stalling, but there are different signs that he might be preparing for new offensives. What's the tactic? How do you assess the capabilities of the Russian army so far after almost a month of fighting? So the general assessment of the disposition for the moment.
Well, I think the general assessment that you hear from different experts in the West, that is, of course, this has been very difficult for the Russian army. They have clearly, both FSB and the army, they have misjudged the Ukraine situation. So they have achieved far, far less than they had expected to do. The expectation is that they will now, perhaps at some point in time, they need a pause to replenish the forces, to take care of all of the wounded and the dead, but that they will aim to throw more forces at it. I think we now have a situation where you have sort of 70–80% of the Russian armed forces engaged. More forces can be brought to bear, but it will be lower quality. But over time, of course, quantity of low quality and massive firepower might have an impact. But it's likely to turn, sorry to say, even more bloody, even more horrible, even more tragic on present trends.
We see that the Western countries are essentially doubling down on weapon supplies to Ukraine.
Yep.
Do you think that it is sufficient now, particularly in terms of air defense? Are sufficient air defense being supplied? What do you hear about potential supplies of S-300, S-400 systems from Slovakia or Turkey? And actually, will these new weaponry supplies be able to change the military equation to maybe support a potential counteroffensive on the Ukrainian side, or are we still far from that?
If you look at the Western supplies that have been coming in, there has been a lot of anti-tank and anti-armor weaponry, which I think is the most critical thing in order to stop the offensive and strike at the logistics and make it more difficult, and it has had an effect. The advantage of these weapons is that you can spread them fairly widely and you can use them. If you talk about these more sophisticated air defense systems, they are available in limited quantities, they require a lot of training, so they might be more difficult to get in. I don't know the technical details. It might be possible to supply or resupply, to be precise. If Ukraine has S-300s, it might be possible to resupply missiles, I don't know. The S-400 system from Turkey would be more complicated because you require a lot of training. And it's fairly easy to detect that system when it moves in as well. And the Russians might move against it. So Stinger missiles, very, very important because they can bring down helicopters and others. Anti-tank, anti-armor, but then let's not forget that there is a need of a lot of food, medicine, financial support to keep the Ukrainian armed forces in a good shape.
There's this issue which have been scaring a lot of people across the globe, that Russian officials, including Deputy Foreign Minister Rybkov, have been saying that they might consider Western military convoys delivering military assistance to Ukraine as legitimate targets for the Russian strikes. But since these wars, we actually haven't seen any actions because military convoys are moving nonetheless. However, Russians have been refraining from hitting them. May that happen? What do you generally think about the potential for a direct military confrontation between Russian forces and NATO forces surrounding this conflict? And is there any potential for Putin not stopping at Ukraine but moving further, like for instance towards the Baltic republics or Poland, which has been heavily discussed in the past few days?
Well, on the latter question, I think that possibility is very limited because the Russian army is obviously sort of having other things to do, to put it very mildly. I mean, this has proved to be far, far more difficult than they envisaged. And if they have the order by the president, which I'm quite certain that they have, to conquer the vast territory of Ukraine, they certainly don't have forces available to do anything whatsoever elsewhere at the moment. On the first question, I think most experts in the West, and I agree with that, see a desperate regime in the Kremlin. Mr. Putin wants to win because he knows that to lose is really to lose virtually everything. He can't really even contemplate that. Accordingly, he's likely to escalate in the different ways that he can escalate. And can he in any sort of way strike at the supply system of the Ukrainian forces? I'm quite certain that he will try to do that. Will that envisage strikes into NATO territory? It could. I think he would prefer to do it in a way that is not easy to attribute to the Russian armed forces directly. But I'm quite certain this is part of the preparations that are done in the West. The fact that this could in fact happen. He's desperate. He thinks he can escalate himself out of the situation. Whether that works is highly debatable. But that's clearly the message that he gives if you listen to his different speeches.
What do you make of the ongoing peace talks? There's been less talk about that in the past few days, but previously were reports of some potential breakthrough. Now, several aspects. You wrote a very spot-on tweet that, based on previous experience, there's a very big difference between what Russians are discussing at the diplomatic talks and what they actually do on the ground.
Yeah.
And second, I understand that issues are discussed like Ukraine's neutrality status, obligation never to join any bloc, obvious in NATO in the first place, and maybe even surrendering some part of the territory which is currently controlled by the Russians. What do you hear about the peace talks, and how do you estimate the possibilities of different scenarios of potential ceasefire?
Well, I haven't heard very much during the last few days, as you know. It's been fairly quiet on that particular front. But you can read different things in the newspapers. It's about NATO neutrality. I could point out that when we had the sort of initial Russian aggression, the invasion, 2014, Crimea, and trying to create Novorossiya and Donbass and all of that, Ukraine had neutrality in its constitution. Sort of the NATO thing has come later because of what happened in 2014. So I think we should recognize that the ambitions of Mr. Putin has very little to do with NATO. De facto, it has everything to do with control of Ukraine as a whole. And that's also when I read, as you know, I don't know Russian, but I can read the English transcripts of what he's saying. And he talks all the time about what he called the demilitarization, which means Russian military control, and denazification, which means sort of Russian political, FSB political control. That's his aims. And I haven't seen anything indicating so far that he's prepared to back down from that. I think he's not, President Zelensky is saying, can't we meet? And the message from the Kremlin is, no, we are not ready for that. I think he wants to be in a far stronger military position before he's ready to do anything. And as you pointed out, or you had seen my tweet, when I go back to what happened primarily in the spring of 2014, the entire battle for Novorossiya, you can call it, we had, and I was involved in those, numerous talks with Foreign Minister Lavrov. But when we look back on the record of those, nothing of that was of any relevance whatsoever to what was happening on the ground. It was obvious, and I think that's been obvious throughout this process, that there's a fundamental disconnect between MID and the persons running this particular war. The MID does now and then what they are told to say, but I don't think we can see them as a viable interlocutor or a viable partner when it comes to this issue, sorry to say.
Yeah, and last question in this regard. I hear many people actually being very concerned that the West might be pressuring President Zelensky and Ukrainian government to actually give up on some of their positions, maybe surrender some territory or make commitments on a neutrality status or whatever, just simply to end the bloodshed. Now, do you hear such reports? Is there really such a pressure on Zelensky from Western powers, and is that viable? I mean, would Putin's obligations under any sort of agreement would be worthy enough to actually give him concessions?
I personally doubt that. Whether there has been that sort of advice to President Zelensky, I don't know. I don't think it's been coming from the major countries anyhow. The major supporting countries are saying, of course, it's up to President Zelensky. It is not up to us to say to him which should be the terms that he sets. But then it should be pointed out that in terms of a possible political solution, underlying that I don't see at the moment, there are two aspects of it. First, there's a question between Moscow and Kiev, between President Putin and President Zelensky. The second is that there's an issue between Russia and the outside world, you can call the Europeans and the Americans. The sanctions that we have imposed will be there until the end of aggression. The resolution by the United General Assembly was a very strong one, and aggression is the #1 crime under international law, and that will not go unpunished. There has to be stop of aggression. There has to be no recognition of any fruits of that particular aggression. There probably will have to be sort of responsibility for war crimes that have been committed, and there will in all probability also have to be massive repatriation or massive compensations paid in terms of the rebuilding of Ukraine for the lifting of sanctions. As you hear, these are not particularly easy terms, but the crime of aggression is the fundamental and the most serious of crimes that we have in international law, and will be treated as such by the Americans and the Europeans and most of the rest of the world.